December 10th, 1942, the Indian Ocean, midnight. The sea is black glass, motionless, endless. Far below the surface, a crippled Japanese submarine drifts through the dark, its engines silent, its lights dead, its compass broken clean in half. The captain is gone. The navigator lies still beside the shattered chart table. Only 6 men are left alive. The pressure outside the hull hums like something ancient and angry. Somewhere above them, the British battleship HMS Repulse cuts through the waves, a monster of steel and thunder. Her guns can split a destroyer in two. Her searchlights crawl across the surface like the eyes of a god. Inside the submarine, the air tastes of oil and fear. Corporal Matsuo Saitō wipes grease from his hands and looks at the broken compass lying at his knees. The red needle trembles without direction, quivering like it wants to flee. He was never meant to lead. He fixes machines. He cleans valves. But tonight there is no captain, no navigator, no orders. There is only one torpedo left in the tube, one weapon, one chance. Saitō breathes slow. He listens to the sound of the sea, to the tiny clicks of metal cooling around him. Then he looks up at the faint light leaking through the periscope glass. The moonlight bends on the waves above, one thin, trembling line. In that reflection he sees a bearing. In that moment, the mechanic becomes a gunner. In 7 minutes he will aim blind and hit a battleship he cannot see. The trap. The hunt had begun before dawn. The Japanese submarine I-58 was patrolling south of Ceylon, where British convoys cut through the Indian Ocean on their way to supply the front. For 3 days, the crew had stalked smoke on the horizon, dark plumes that marked enemy ships. Then on the morning of December 10th, the sea itself turned against them. 2 British destroyers appeared like grey knives out of the fog. They moved fast, silent, closing the distance before the submarine could dive. Within minutes, the first depth charge dropped. A hollow splash, a heartbeat, and then the ocean exploded. The hull screamed. Pipes burst. Men were thrown against bulkheads as the lights flickered out. Water poured through hairline cracks that no one had time to seal. Another charge, then another. Each blast closer than the last, each one hammering at the steel like the fist of an angry god. The compass shattered on the third. The glass face blew apart, the needle spinning off into the dark. The gyro repeater died with a pop and a hiss. By noon, the I-58 was blind. No bearings, no navigation, no control. She dropped down to 90 meters. Her hull bending inward under the weight of the sea. Inside, the air thickened. Every breath felt borrowed. The captain was hit by a flying fragment of metal. He died without a sound. The radio operator tried to call for help, but static swallowed his words. Somewhere aft, the batteries began to leak acid into the bilge. By sunset, the survivors were silent. They drifted in the dark, waiting for the next explosion, for the next sound of tearing metal that would end everything. But the destroyers never came back. They had spent their charges and sailed north, convinced the submarine was already a tomb. When night fell, the sea grew still. The only sound was the slow tick of a pressure gauge that no longer meant anything. Corporal Saitō sat by the dead compass, staring at the shards scattered across the floor. He could feel the submarine listing slightly to port, pulled by a weak current. He pressed his palm against the steel hull and felt it. A pulse, faint but rhythmic, coming from somewhere far above. Engines. Big ones. He realized then that the British fleet hadn't gone far. They were circling, and the HMS Repulse, that massive armored silhouette, was still near enough that he could feel its heartbeat through the water. He looked around the compartment. 6 men left. 1 torpedo. No captain. No compass. The manual said to surface, repair, and reorient before firing. But manuals were written by men who hadn't seen death through cracked steel. Saitō knew that if they surfaced, they'd die before the hatch opened. He looked back at the periscope. Through the fractured lens, the sea shimmered with faint silver. The moon had risen, and in that thin reflection, bending gently with the current, he saw something the others did not. Direction. It wasn't a compass. It wasn't even clear. But it was enough. He turned to the crew, voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "We still have one weapon," he said. "Then we use it," the others stared. One of them whispered, "With what aim?" Saitō looked down at the broken compass, its lifeless needle pointing nowhere. Then he pointed upward, to the light filtering through the periscope. "That one," he said. The impossible aim. The idea came not as a flash of genius, but as a slow, cold arithmetic that crept into Saitō's bones. In the dim glow of one emergency lamp, he began to list facts, small, stubborn facts the sea could not erase. Torpedoes, he remembered, did not travel as arrows. They rode and wrestled with the water. For the first few dozen seconds after launch, a torpedo's hull was at the mercy of currents and eddies. Only after the gyro took hold would it hold a steady bearing. The gyroscope could be set to any angle, but it could not command the sea. If the current pushed east, a torpedo set to run straight would nonetheless arc with that push until the gyro reasserted itself. That was the margin, 40 seconds, sometimes more, when drift ruled over design. Outside the periscope, the moon lay behind a seam of cloud, a pale, sputtering coin. Where the clouds thinned, the surface of the ocean flashed silver in thin veins. Those veins were not random. They braided with the wind, with swell, with the pull of distant currents and the wake of ships. Saitō watched that ripple of light and began to see, with the peculiar clarity of someone reduced to essentials, what others might have called a gamble. The ocean had a geometry if you knew how to read it. He picked up the periscope's broken mirror, like a surgeon taking a scalpel. The glass was cracked, spider-veined from the earlier concussion, but it still reflected a band of moonlight. He held the shard over the viewing hole and angled it until the silver trail lay along the line of sight. With one eye to the cracked lens and one ear to the hull, he began to translate light to bearing. His hands worked without fuss. He knew the launch table by memory, the depth settings, the rudder trim, the charge to set for range. But this was not a table problem. It was a curve. He thought of the current as a slow, invisible wind, and the torpedo as a kite that would sag downwind until its internal guidance took over. He thought of drift coefficients and of the last exercise he'd watched the gunnery crew run in calm water off a shore base. A torpedo launched in a steady current would describe a gentle arc, the extent of which could be predicted if you knew current speed, torpedo speed, and time to gyro lock. He did not have instruments that would spit numbers at him. He had, at best, a sense. The sea pulled southwest tonight. The wake, behind a freighter 2 hours earlier, had curved this way. The floating oil slick had crawled gently to starboard. He added up those impressions in his head and converted them to degrees the only way he could, by thinking of the watch face his father had given him when he joined the Navy, and by calibrating the mirror's line against the periscope sight's hashed markings. 17 degrees. No one would call it precise. No one would sign their name to it. But it was a number, and a number was something better than nothing. He spoke, low and fast, to the men around him. There was no panic in his voice. Panic would scatter whatever focus they had. There was only work. Set depth 4 meters, he said. Speed 40 knots, trim 0. Rudder 17 degrees east. Weiss, who had been Saitō's companion on maintenance runs since the ship sailed from Kure, frowned. 17? Where from? Saitō held up the mirror. The shard reflected the silver trail like a river. The light, the drift, 17. He could feel their teeth against the bulkhead, the soft staccato of someone breathing too fast. Flood the tube, he ordered. Calibrate gyro to compensate 3 degrees for precession. Delay firing sequence 3 seconds after the bell. Those were the sorts of micro-commands practiced in drills, the kind threaded into muscle memory by crews who drilled until their thumbs knew the steps by themselves. But nearly every step Saitō was giving now subverted doctrine, the command to set rudder without a compass reading, the instruction to trust a mirror over a repeater, the choice to accept drift as a friend instead of an enemy. It was improvisation measured against the calendar of mortality. The crew moved, even the stoic men with faces like hammered metal, and there were men among them who had not spoken since the captain fell, moved with the mechanical grace of those who had trained for years. They sluiced water into the tube, watched the pressure gauge as the column filled. The torpedo's warhead glinted cold in the belly of the launcher, a long shadow in the dim light. The priming mechanism clicked into readiness. Saitō felt the machinery vibrate under his palm. Their ship, their small machine of survival. He checked the firing crank, the old brass wheel worn bright by 100 hands. His thumb traced a notch. He locked the angle with a pull that itself felt like a vow. It was one thing to set numbers on a board and another to carry the weight. Of consequence, when each notch meant the difference between life and a name read at a funeral. "Why show the mirror?" whispered Carmichael, barely audible. "Because the sea shows what the needle cannot," Saitō answered, voice steady. "And because we have nothing else." He thought then about the torpedo's behavior in the first 30 seconds. The gyroscope would not keep the initial heading absolutely true until the gyros unwound and stabilized. The run-out would be messy. The torpedo would be at the mercy of eddies and of the residual wake of passing destroyers. Yet messiness had its patterns, and patterns could be predicted. The current's vector tonight pushed a slow sweep to the east of the bearing the ship would have taken. Saitō wanted the torpedo to begin slightly off, to be nudged by the current into the path of the ship as the gyros seized control. There was a calculus to that. Torpedo speed, current speed, anticipated ship velocity, the time to gyro lock. All those variables reduced in his head into a single actionable decision. He set the rudder not toward the ship, but into a calculated miss with the faith that the ocean would right it. He called for the bell sequence. The old clockwork inside. The launching mechanism clicked, each sound somehow magnified within the submarine, like footsteps in a cathedral. The men around him tightened, fingers white on railings. For a moment there was only preparation, the mechanical breathing of pumps, the small clank of a safety pin set. Even in the darkness, small details presented themselves with sudden, unbearable clarity. The pattern of oil staining the bulkhead, the way the lamp's light slid across a face lined with salt, the tiny tear in a glove where a seam had given under pressure. At the lever, Saitō hesitated long enough to feel the world tilt. He thought of a compass that no longer pointed, of a captain whose hand had been plucked from the chart table. He thought, briefly, of home. Rice fields wet with the season's first rain, his sister sweeping a doorway. Then he pushed. The torpedo roared into the dark like a bell released down a shaft. The tube expelled it with a violent hiccup, and the sound compressed into a metallic slap that hammered through the submarine's frame. For a second, the water was full of the torpedo's wake, a bright filament snaking away into blackness. The men watched that filament like people watching the carrier pigeons of a desperate message, and then they waited. 40 seconds can be a lifetime. They counted in their heads, fingers tracing notches on memory. The submarine itself seemed to hold its breath. Each meter of depth pressed outward on the hull like a hand, making the men feel small, every creak and groan of steel amplified like thunder. Saito's mind was a ledger of possibilities, flipping from outcome to outcome, running through contingencies. If the torpedo ran shallow and missed ahead, if the current eddied unexpectedly, if the gyros failed. His chest tightened with each possibility. At 32 seconds, a distant thump rippled through the water. It could have been a whale or an exploding canister. At 36, someone whispered a prayer they did not remember learning. At 40, nothing. At 43, there was a faint, distant popping, like a string of distant firecrackers far away in a coastal town. The hull vibrated with a low, rolling concussion that made plates on a table tremble. The men exchanged looks. It was an impact far away, but it was impact nonetheless. Then at 47 seconds, the sound came through. A deep, resonant boom, a hollow thunder that rose from the sea as if the ocean itself had cracked. It was followed seconds later by a higher metallic shriek, the sound of metal rending, of a plate giving way, of a hull that had been struck and responded with the noise of a great animal wounded. And then a second, higher, sharper detonation as munitions inside the hit ship ignited, sending a bloom of pressure that rolled across the water and into their ears. There was no cheering, there was only the slow release of breath, like small animals stepping out of a trap. Faces that had been carved into stone relaxed a fraction. Someone laughed, and the sound was thin and brief, like a reed snapping in winter. Saitō felt the relief as a physical warmth, not because victory was guaranteed. The sea could still take them, but because the immediate danger had in that moment been shifted away from their own hull. The torpedo had found its mark. The mathematics, the mirror, the drift, the risk had paid off. Yet even as they allowed themselves that small comfort, Saito's mind did not stop. He began, even amidst the first flaring of triumph, to plot their next act. That was the only true discipline of men who survived at sea, the refusal to stand in the glow of a single success and forget the long, cold ledger of consequences that followed. The enemy could still find them by sound, by direction of the blast. Survivors in the water would attract rescue ships. Allied sailors would radio out. Escorting vessels would comb the charts. The world would narrow around them once more. He ordered immediate silent running procedures. Vents secured, pumps slowed to barely a whisper, the ship trimmed deeper. They killed unnecessary lights and battened over hatches. They waited, the torpedo's success not yet a map to safety, but a bargaining chip in the vast economy of survival. The sea carried their work away in a ripple and left them once more alone with the dark. In those minutes, the improbable truth settled like silt. They had done the impossible, not by magic but by care, by a depth of technical knowledge welded to brittle courage. Saitō had used light as an instrument and the ocean as a partner. He had chosen to aim not directly for victory, but for the intersection where human calculation and natural drift met. It was not glory in the formal sense, no citation would be written in his name that night, but it was the small, private geometry that let 6 men live another dawn. Aftermath. Silence came first, not the silence of peace, but that strange, heavy quiet that follows a scream too loud to echo. The submarine floated in the dark, the sound of its heartbeat swallowed by the ocean. Corporal Saitō kept his ear pressed against the hull, feeling for a rhythm, any rhythm, that wasn't their own. Nothing, no engine thrum, no propeller churn, no pursuing sonar pings, only the slow creak of pressure easing around them as if the sea itself had exhaled. He looked at the others. 5 men, faces pale under the emergency lamp. No one dared to speak it aloud, but each man knew what had happened. Somewhere above, their torpedo had found the HMS Repulse. Then faintly, the ocean whispered confirmation. A low, rolling thunder carried through the deep. A metallic scream, then another, higher one, the distinct tearing sound of steel folding upon itself. Moments later, a second explosion, deeper, more final. A magazine going up. The Repulse was dying. Saitō closed his eyes. He had no hatred for the men aboard that ship. He could see them in his mind. Sailors scrambling for lifeboats, officers shouting orders that would never be obeyed. Men who, moments ago, were hunters, and now were sinking through black water, mouths open in silence. No one cheered. No one raised their voice in triumph, because in the deep, victory and death sounded the same. The submarine drifted for hours, its power gone, batteries almost drained. When dawn finally came, pale and distant through the periscope lens, the crew surfaced cautiously. The ocean stretched quiet and empty in all directions, an endless grey plain, but the proof lay there. oil slicks spreading across the water in slow, lazy spirals, bits of debris, twisted metal, scraps of wood, a single lifebuoy marked Repulse, and in the distance, the faint shimmer of fire still burning on the waves. They had done it. A crippled submarine with one torpedo, no compass, and no captain had brought down a British warship 10 times its size. Saitō leaned against the conning tower, letting the wind hit his face. For a moment he felt the tremor in his hands, the delayed weight of what they'd done. He had aimed a weapon blind, guided only by moonlight, geometry, and desperation. And somehow, impossibly, the ocean had agreed with him. Below deck, the crew gathered quietly. They didn't talk about medals or glory. They spoke of repairs, of rationing power, of finding a friendly port before the British fleet came looking. Survival was their only mission now. Hours later, just as the sun began to sink, the lookout shouted. Saitō climbed the ladder, squinting into the wind. There, far off on the horizon, the faint silhouettes of ships, not British, Japanese, a convoy heading east towards Singapore. He felt something break loose inside his chest. Relief, disbelief, exhaustion, all tangled together. He raised a flare, watched its red light bloom and fade over the water. The convoy turned toward them. Rescue. When the I-58 was finally towed into harbor 3 days later, it looked less like a vessel than a ghost. Its hull was pitted with scars, its paint stripped away, its antenna snapped like bones. But it was alive. 6 men walked down the gangway. Naval Command filed the report with disbelief. A single torpedo? No compass, no captain. It sounded like superstition or madness. Yet reconnaissance confirmed the truth. The wreck of HMS Repulse lay in pieces across the seafloor, torn open from below by a direct hit. For Saitō, there were no medals, no parade. His name appeared in a single line of a naval dispatch. Mechanic Second Class Matsuo Saitō assisted in emergency firing operation during engagement in the Indian Ocean. That was all. But among sailors, stories travel faster than orders. Soon, whispers began to move from ship to ship of the mechanic who aimed by the moon, the man who found direction in light when every compass was dead. They called it the crossed barrel trick, a term invented by some anonymous gunner who had heard it third hand and turned it into legend. The story changed with every telling. In one version, Saitō calculated his target using the stars. In another, he used the reflection of the moon on oil slicks to triangulate distance. In all versions, one thing remained constant: a man, a broken compass, and a torpedo that found its mark. Years later, after the war, divers found the wreck of HMS Repulse. The torpedo hole was exactly where Saito's bearing would have placed it, 17 degrees off-center, below the forward magazine. The strike had hit so perfectly that the battleship's back broke in two. Saitō never saw that report. He returned home quietly, working as a mechanic again, this time fixing cars instead of weapons. He married. He raised children who never knew that their father had once changed the shape of a battle with a broken instrument and a scrap of mirror. And when he died, his medals were still in a box he never opened. But the story lived on, retold by sailors, by engineers, by historians who didn't believe in coincidence. Because what Saitō proved that night wasn't just that a torpedo could find its mark without guidance. It was that precision doesn't live in instruments. It lives in the hands of those who understand them, and sometimes, when every compass breaks, when every line on the map ends, and when every doctrine fails, the ocean still listens to those who know how to aim by light. Legacy of the trick. Years passed. The war ended, the flags changed, and the oceans quieted. The submarines that had once haunted the depths became relics in harbors, their steel shells rusting under a different sun. But the story of the I-58 and the mechanic with the broken compass refused to die. It moved through the world like a rumor carried by tide, resurfacing wherever men fought with the sea. The first time it reappeared was 8 years later. During the Korean War, a U.S. Navy submarine, USS Catfish, found itself blind in the Yellow Sea. A malfunction in the gyro compass left them disoriented, drifting dangerously close to enemy waters. The captain ordered a retreat, but a young lieutenant, a former engineer, asked for permission to fire a test torpedo using only optical reflection bearings. When the exercise was over, the crew swore they had seen something uncanny. The torpedo struck a floating target half a mile off course, dead center. No one could explain it. The lieutenant said nothing of the Japanese mechanic. But among the older sailors, someone remembered the whispers from the last war, the man who aimed by moonlight. The phrase stuck. 20 years later, in Vietnam, it happened again. A small riverine patrol craft, callsign Delta 7, was ambushed on the Sa Mau Peninsula. The gunner's compass was shot to pieces. The captain was wounded. With artillery rounds closing in, Specialist Robert Chen, barely 21, aimed his mortar by aligning it with the reflection of tracer fire on the water's surface. He adjusted for current, wind, and instinct. The first round overshot. The second hit the tree line. The third silenced the ambush. When the report was filed, the section labeled Method of Target Acquisition was left blank. Nobody knew how to explain it without sounding insane. Chen didn't claim a miracle. He simply said, "I knew the river was moving east. It would take decades before anyone put the pattern together." In 1974, a Royal Navy historian named Dr. Edward Palmer was cataloguing Japanese naval reports when he came across a single, brief line in an after-action log from December 1942. Emergency firing conducted by mechanic Matsuo Saitō, compass destroyed. Hit confirmed. Palmer thought little of it until he read a classified British dispatch written the same day. HMS Repulse struck by unidentified torpedo, bearing uncertain. Possible magnetic mine, though path suggests human aim. That phrase, human aim, haunted him. How could a blind submarine without navigation or sightlines deliver a precision strike that broke a battleship's spine? Palmer began to dig. He collected fragments, interviews, war diaries, diver logs, ship schematics. He reconstructed the angle of attack, the current patterns in the Indian Ocean that night, even lunar positions. And when he ran the geometry, the answer appeared. 17 degrees off compass, adjusted by current and moon reflection. He stared at the chart for hours. It shouldn't have worked. It couldn't have worked. And yet mathematically, it was perfect. He titled his paper, The Crossed Barrel Hypothesis, Improvised Bearings in Submarine Warfare. The Navy refused to publish it, calling it speculative myth. But the legend had already begun to crawl back into daylight. By the time the 21st century arrived, the trick had become a ghost in training manuals. No official doctrine listed it, yet every veteran gunner had heard of it. Sometimes it was called the broken compass method. Sometimes the reverse bearing shot, but among the old submariners, it was still Saito's light. In 2009, off the coast of Somalia, a Japanese maritime self-defense force training vessel conducted an exercise in rough weather. A young officer, Lieutenant Arta, was ordered to simulate firing with disabled instruments. He remembered something he'd read on an obscure military forum. A tale about a widow mechanic who had aimed by the moon. Otter waited until the clouds broke. He found the faint glimmer of the moon on the waves and aligned his bearings by hand. When the torpedo drone hit its target buoy 6 kilometers away, his instructors called it coincidence. But Otter smiled. He knew what he'd done and who he'd learned it from. Back in Japan, in a small town outside Nagasaki, an old photograph still hung in a mechanic's shop that smelled of grease and pine oil. The photo showed 6 men standing on the deck of a battered submarine. One of them squinted at the camera, his hands stained black from the engines. There was no caption, only a compass nailed to the wall beside it, the needle frozen in place, forever trembling between east and south. Visitors often asked about it. The owner, Saito's son, would simply say, "My father said it pointed true once." That was enough. Historians now call it the legacy of precision, not because of what Saito destroyed, but because of what he proved. That mastery is not obedience to instruments. It's understanding them so deeply you can live without them. That war, in its chaos, still leaves room for the quiet logic of a single man with a broken tool and an unbroken will. And somewhere, far beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean, where oil still clings to coral and the bones of the repulse lie folded into the seabed, the light still filters down, fractured, soft, and silver. The same light that once struck a cracked mirror in the hands of a young mechanic who turned it into the straightest line the ocean had ever seen. The final reflection. The ocean forgets nothing. It only buries, beneath the calm blue skin of the Indian Ocean, the wreck of HMS Repulse still sleeps, a forest of steel now overgrown with coral. Crabs crawl through what used to be the bridge. Fish glide past shattered gun barrels. The once proud warship, killer and casualty both, lies tilted on her side in a grave of sand and silence. Every few years, divers descend to her hull. They touch the torn metal where the torpedo struck. They photograph the wound, clean, precise, almost surgical. And even now, in the grainy light of the deep, the line of impact still points 17 degrees off true north. The same error that saved 6 men and doomed 800. On land, time did what time always does. Records faded, memories softened, and war turned into documentaries and textbooks. Children learned the names of admirals and operations, not mechanics. But the story of Matsuo Saitō never quite vanished. It traveled in mess halls, in veterans, bars, in the half-remembered stories of old sailors who swore they'd once met a man who aimed with a mirror. When Saitō died in 1971, his funeral was small. A handful of neighbors, no uniform, no medals. Yet on the workbench in his shop sat a single compass, its casing cracked, its needle frozen forever between east and south. Someone, perhaps his wife, had written on a piece of paper beside it. It pointed once. That was enough. Years later, his grandson visited the Naval Museum at Kure. In a quiet corner behind a glass panel, he found a rusted torpedo gyroscope marked Recovered Indian Ocean 1943. No name, no origin. He stood there for a long time, watching the metal twist of its coils. When the curator asked if he wanted to know more, the young man simply said, "I already do." Outro. The geometry of Courage War remembers its generals, but history is held together by the hands of its mechanics, the ones who fix, improvise, and refuse to let broken instruments decide their fate. Saitō never planned to become legend. He did not command fleets or write doctrine. He simply saw light where others saw dark and turned that light into direction. That is the secret buried inside every story like his. That precision is not a matter of perfect tools, but of imperfect men who learn to listen. That courage is not loud. It's a breath held steady long enough to take one more shot, and that sometimes, when every compass breaks, when every order fails, when the whole world tilts off its axis, the only way forward is to aim by instinct, by reflection, by faith in the line you can't see. The sea has long since reclaimed the noise of that night, but somewhere, deep beneath the Indian Ocean, a rusted torpedo still rests in its final arc, a trace of mathematics and memory written across the water. It is proof that one man, with nothing but a broken compass and the courage to use it, can still draw a straight line through chaos. And that line, invisible, unwavering, eternal, is the true bearing of history.